Thank you all for coming along, and thanks to the Institute of Race Relations for supporting this evening, and thanks to Chris and Lars and everyone at the Independent Social Research Foundation who supported my writing the book with a fellowship. And it's a huge honour to be launching the book with Ruthie, whose work has been so penetrating and exemplary. I began thinking about this book in the summer of 2020 when in the United States, where I live, we had at least 15 million people participating in the Black Lives Matter insurrection across the United States. And that summer, the people of the United States declared in an opinion poll that they supported the burning down of police stations as a form of anti-racist protest. So this was a remarkable moment. And as with any movement, people were involved for many different reasons. But the aims of defunding the police, of abolishing prisons, abolishing ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, those were the central kind of demands. And the activists accused policing and carceral and border agencies of not reducing violence, but adding to it. They were not organisations that made us safer, but infrastructures of racist violence and inequality. And the problem was not just individually biased police officers, prison officers, deportation officers, who were deviating from rules of appropriate behaviour, but the character of those rules themselves was what the problem that was being highlighted, right? So the people on the streets understood racism as this kind of structural force. They weren't calling for those infrastructures of violence to be reformed through better officer training or increasing the diversity of officers or something like that. They demanded the dismantling of these infrastructures, right? But what interested me especially in thinking about this book was how the institutions of liberal America then responded to this insurrection in the summer of 2020. And everywhere you looked, you saw white liberals who were talking about how to challenge unconscious biases, how to reduce microaggressions in interpersonal relationships, how to better represent diverse identities, how to educate away individual prejudices, and how to stop right-wing extremism. So it seemed to me that liberals had substituted one definition of racism for another. Instead of the kind of macroaggressions of police, of prisons, of border infrastructures, they were focusing on the microaggressions of individual biases. So the starting point for the book is that we need to distinguish actually between two quite different anti-racist traditions, one liberal and one more radical. That's my daughter, by the way, who's heckling me there. So the liberal tradition sees racism as essentially a matter of irrational beliefs and attitudes, right? Its founders, such as the anthropologist Ruth Benedict and the gay rights pioneer Magnus Hirschfeld, they were interested in understanding the rise of Nazism in the 1930s, and they concluded that in societies where there were widespread racial prejudices, liberal democracy could be undermined by political extremists inflaming race hatred to gain power. And to remove this danger, they called on the liberal establishment to persuade the masses, especially the poor and the uneducated, that racist opinions have no legitimate basis. And this approach remains the core of liberal anti-racism today. You see it in the diversity training, which is a $4.3 billion business in the United States, to the idea that if we just get better representation in Hollywood movies, then that's going to educate us out of our biases. The difference now, the only difference from how this looked 100 years ago, is that liberals now think about this as an unconscious bias problem as much as a conscious bias problem, right? Now, the radical tradition, on the other hand, sees racism as a matter of how resources are distributed differently across racial groups. So, for example, in a 1938 article by C.L.I. James, he talks about racism in Africa. He's arguing that British colonial racism was not a set of beliefs or attitudes, but a structure of generally observed social rules and policies that enable economic exploitation. Individual racist attitudes no doubt existed, but were not the decisive factor. Likewise, Frans Fanon argued in 1956 that we should abandon the habit of what he called regarding racism as a disposition of the mind, a psychological flaw. Rather, he says, military and economic oppression most frequently precedes, makes possible, and legitimates racist beliefs. And this systematic oppression of a people can continue even if a majority of citizens do not have racist biases, unconsciously held or otherwise. So radical anti-racists argue that the only way to fight this oppression is to build autonomous organisations with the power to dismantle our existing social systems and to build new ones. To them, racism is closely connected to capitalism. This is partly because racism weakens class struggle by dividing white workers from most of the world's working people, but more fundamentally, race provides a means by which capitalism can more intensively exploit certain categories of worker, the enslaved, the indentured, colonised peasantries, migrant workers, and so on, as well as justified discarding peoples who are deemed superfluous to the economy. So the book tells the story of these two different traditions of anti-racism through the 20th century. And I argue that while liberal anti-racism has given us some measure of progress in terms of interpersonal relationships over the last few decades, in the era of neoliberalism, it's become powerless against the kind of new structures of racism that have been erected. Now, to understand that, we need to begin by thinking about the limitations of the prevailing story of neoliberalism that the white left tends to tell itself. So in the British version of that story, we begin with the achievements of the 1945 Labour government. How finally, after a long struggle, we were able to create a cradle-to-grave system of welfare to enable us to live in dignity with waged work for everyone, an income in retirement, universal education, housing and healthcare, and so on. And then the story goes that our ruling class was able to take advantage of the crises of the 1970s to push back against this welfare state. Pinochet in Chile comes first, then Thatcher and Reagan. So the more egalitarian societies of the mid-20th century then give way to a kind of competitive culture in which the poor are held responsible for their own fates, principles of social solidarity are shredded, and every aspect of life is subjected to the logic of market competition, from democracy to dating. So this story implies that the task today for the left is to reverse this neoliberal transformation of the last 50 years. And something like this story has been central, I think, to the movements around Jeremy Corbyn here in the UK and Bernie Sanders in the US. And it's a good story, but it's a partial story. And it leaves out how the neoliberal project involved the creation of new and distinctive forms of racist and neo-colonial domination. The impetus for the neoliberal turn came as much from decolonisation in the Third World and black struggle in the United States as from the white left in the West. Neoliberals, in fact, saw organised labour in the West and anti-colonial nationalism elsewhere as equivalent and related threats. As Lionel Robbins, one of the original cohort of neoliberal thinkers, put it, the mines for the miners and Papua for the Papuans are analytically similar slogans. And as neoliberal think tanks, politicians and intellectuals gained political influence, they worked with Western governments to configure new global and domestic racial boundaries to replace the older ones that had been weakened by decolonisation and the Black Freedom Movement. Racism today is not, as commonly conceived, some kind of hangover from the past, some kind of legacy of the past, but an infrastructure of repression generated over the last half century by neoliberalism's reconfiguring of these older structures. This happened because neoliberal intellectuals were deeply focused upon the cultural conditions that they thought were necessary to get people to follow the impositions of market discipline without having to be continuously coerced to do so. They understood that so-called free markets depend on whether people are willing to pursue their desires through market mechanisms and accept the distribution of resources that markets generate. That willingness, or lack of it, is a matter of cultural values. And neoliberal intellectuals were deeply anxious about whether those cultural values extended outside of the West. As the neoliberal project unfolded, it became clear that vast swathes of humanity would not be easily incorporated into the market order being built. Neoliberalism generated large populations of people uprooted from pre-existing livelihoods, but unable to be absorbed into neoliberal labour markets. These populations, deemed surplus to neoliberal markets, are what Cameroonian theorist Achille Mbembe calls the abandoned subjects. They are hardly needed at all by capitalism. For those populations deemed surplus, neoliberalism had to be imposed by force. Thus, the world the neoliberals wished to create could only be brought into existence and maintained through border violence, military violence, economic violence on a colossal scale. And within the terms of their philosophy, this violence could only be justified by presenting other cultures as by nature deficient. The more neoliberalism did not receive universal consent, the more neoliberals relied upon racist ideas of culture to manage their anxieties, organise their proposals, and legitimise their aggression. It's these surplus populations, both inside and outside the West, who are the targets of the new infrastructures of violence that neoliberalism has generated. It's they who make up the tens of thousands who have fled the destruction of their countries only to suffer the death by policy of drowning in the Mediterranean. It's this same disposable humanity who's been slaughtered on an industrial scale in the global wars on terror and drugs, for example, with an estimated 3.6 million indirect deaths in the post-9/11 war zones of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Within the UK, police violence is directed most often at our own abandoned and disproportionately black populations. In the United States, as Ruthie has demonstrated, mass incarceration is linked to the need to manage surplus populations, resources, and land. It's not coincidental that the think tank networks that have been central to promoting neoliberal economics have typically also been the key mobilisers of projects of racist policing, incarceration, and counter-terrorism. It wasn't simply that racism became more subtle or went unconscious after its overt forms had been defeated. It was more that there was no longer a need to routinely make explicit assertions of racial superiority. Racial inequalities were reproduced through neoliberalism's market systems alongside newly intensifying infrastructures of violence carried out in the name of seemingly race-neutral concerns about crime, migration, and terrorism. Liberal notions of diversity and inclusion are completely compatible with these forms of racist structural violence. White liberals can heroically confront their own unconscious biases all they want, yet these structures will remain. Liberal anti-racists demand we use the correct racial vocabulary, but abolishing a word does not abolish the social forces it expresses. They implement diversity training programs, but these fail owing to the mistaken premise that racism now resides primarily in the unconscious mind. And they talk of hate speech and hate crimes on the assumption that oppressive cruelty is the behavioural expression of a hateful disposition, ignoring the corporate executives, asset managers, lawmakers, government officials, judges, police officers, prison guards, military personnel, and immigration officers who, without attitudes of hatred, routinely and calmly operate infrastructures of racist violence in the name of security and profit. By reducing racism to the unconscious mind, to the use of inappropriate words, and to the extremist fringes, liberal anti-racists end up absolving the institutions most responsible for racist practices. They are effective at getting more people of colour into senior jobs in police forces, border agencies, and the military, but unable to get fewer people of colour killed by those same agencies. To be anti-racist today means working collectively with organisations to dismantle those racist border, policing, carceral and military infrastructures. It means organising in the community to get the police out of our schools, taking direct action against deportations, confronting the corporations that trade in colonial violence in Palestine. It means understanding that the poor of the global south are as equally entitled to the world's resources as the wealthy residents of the north. In the end, it requires us to build an economy of care, not killing, uplifting all working classes of whatever colour. And in fighting for that, we're going to have to confront not just external forces, but also what lies within ourselves. Capitalism keeps pushing us to compete with each other, to trample over each other to get a few more crumbs. It breaks our hearts every day. It hardens us. It makes us less human. But we're not going to heal ourselves by turning inward and attending to the uniqueness of our pain, or by searching for some truth about who we are. We heal ourselves through joining in struggle. When we come together in movements, there's deep love, there's deep joy, because we're able to feel human. We come to understand that my happiness is bound up with yours, that I can only be whole if everyone else is whole, that my growth depends on our collective growth. In the words of Gwendolyn Brooks, we are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond. Identity is not a truth inside you waiting to be discovered. It's a creation, not a discovery. It's what you create with others. You are what you do with others. There's always going to be disagreements in our movements, but those disagreements become a source of fracture when your movement is failing to influence events. Then you tend to turn inwards and fight each other. But when you're influencing events, the internal disagreements are not the main focus and can be allowed to take their natural course rather than be exaggerated. And these are all the lessons of our deep and long histories of people's movements. This is how we overthrew European colonialism and redrew the map of the world. Then we came to Britain and we had to fight again. We rose up against the police, against the immigration laws, against all the forces that were killing us. That's the history upon which we stand as we continue to fight. The history that tells us that anti-racism does not fragment class struggle, but radicalizes it. That culture is not a distraction from economic struggles, nor a fixed identity that determines who we are, but it's what we make and renew through our struggles for working people. And because our struggles are unbounded, so is our sense of who we might be. Thank you.
Good evening. Good. It's lovely to be here. I want to thank our sponsors, the ISRF, my old friend Chris Newfield, new friends, Lars Stewart, and others at the Institute for hosting, and my very old, very dear friends at the Institute for Race Relations for co-sponsoring, and my new friend, John, Dr. John. Some of my earliest work was published in Race and Class. And I will tell you, this wasn't like an easy thing to do, to break into those pages. The first thing I ever sent to Sivananda, he hated so thoroughly. And he yelled at me so long. And then at the end he said, "Ruth, have I hurt you?" I said, "Sort of." He said, "Well, send me something else." And I did. All right, I am delighted to talk this evening about Arun's splendid book, and as you could already tell from his comments and from Chris's lovely introduction, it's got an amazing sweep, and its sweep enables us to extend the sweep. So later in my comments, I'll talk about that a little bit. So in the context of the global maldistribution of material and symbolic resources, quoting Stuart Hall, this book, Arun's book, takes up urgent categories of analysis, and by showing us many ways, by showing us in many ways how every determination is also a negation, it insists we make our way by making ways, theoretically and practically, quote, into anti-racism that does not fragment class struggle, but radicalizes it. So that's the last few words of the entire book. Arun shared the words with you. I'm sharing them again. Those closing words are both theme and imperative of many movements and thinkers with whom we think this evening, exploring the conviviality of politics and of becoming, as we dare to claim radical universalism as and drawing from futures for which we fight tirelessly by rearranging the present. So futures for which we fight tirelessly by rearranging the present. Arun's book works through many contradictions, most vividly expressed as liberalism versus anti-capitalism, as individual versus structure, but also white and not white, colonial and decolonial, and so forth. I'm just excited to discuss some of these themes this evening with Arun and all of you who came out to engage in our debate. As many of you know, I have come to think the dynamics of racial capitalism through the co-constitutive processes of organized abandonment and organized violence. In order to think class struggle, as Arun concludes, a broad dynamic of processes, internally contradictory, but not necessarily antagonistically so. And I don't know how many of you here are old enough to remember when all of a sudden, it seemed, in the 1980s, we were all talking about antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. And it was such a liberating moment to think that way. Every point of contact is a site for struggle, not a topic for endless complaint. This is where abolition starts, as life in rehearsal. Abolition requires we change just one thing, everything. And the title of that book that's endlessly delayed is just called Change Everything. It's not called This Changes Everything, it's just Change Everything. Abolition exists already in practices and experiments in many contexts, meaning it is by materialist necessity made of what is, as well as making new or renewed relations. So it's innovative and it also infiltrates frequently. Centrally in Arun's book, the clash between facts and values explodes over and over again. What do I mean? I mean, of course, the difference between whatever accumulation of empirical evidence one gathers as an organizer, as an exhorter, as a scholar or other actor, and what one can make of such evidence by thinking together with comrades in the world as we encounter one another, and by thinking with comrades distant and departed, whose observations and insights help to guide our own as thought action breaks into other forms of thought action, organizing, promoting ideas, and bargaining in the political arena. Those we think with, often by name, M.N. Roy, Claudia Jones, Cedric Robinson, Stuart Hall, Alamin, Siva, frequently appear to us as individual innovators rather than as collectively produced exemplars of thought in process. And I'll talk about myself here. I'm frequently cited and sometimes feel like I've become a meme machine, rather than what I think I actually am, which is somebody who is continually working through theory and practice as it is becoming, in part by looking at how it became. So subjectivity and objectivity are always meaningful. And I was thinking, as an example from Arun's book, that notably Arun mentions, and many others have mentioned over time, that Fanon in Wretched of the Earth puts a bright spotlight on peasants. And many people come away thinking, okay, peasants are going to solve everything, as though peasants were undifferentiated. And of course, Fanon knew better. And his thinking about peasants brings to mind, for example, M.N. Roy's interlocutor and sparring partner, Lenin's extensive writing and thinking about peasants. And that makes me think about how Lenin came to think about peasants. I mean, he was kind of an urban guy. His dad was a school teacher. And what the range of thinking peasants became, for example, in the thought that turned into those debates by 1920 and beyond, and how much Other history, for example, the history of Haiti and the history of the many insurgencies in the Americas, across the Americas, shaped Lenin as well as shaping Marx and shaping others. So there are entire histories that matter, and what's interesting in the struggle today against liberal anti-racism and within neoliberalism is the differentiated appeal to history, as though history were statically available to solve any contemporary problem. Okay, next page. There are so many moments in Arun's book to raise, not as disagreement, except where I do disagree a little bit, but more to enhance our collective capacity to make theoretical interventions that arise from and break into action. So here I'm thinking in particular about how C.L.R. James, in writing that piece of his called Black Power, talked about then Stokely Carmichael and then H. Rap Brown. And he writes, quote, "So long and far-reaching a struggle had needed to know where it was, where it had come from, and where it was going. CLR raised the alarm that where it was going could well be into the jaws of criminalization and premature death." That was why he wrote that piece, in part, was to help preserve Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture's wife. And we do know what happened to Al-Amin so many decades later, right? But that particular possible future was already unrolling. And if we are attentive, we can think about these processes and vulnerabilities and urgencies in relation to so many individuals and movements around the planet today. And certainly criminalization is almost every government's favorite tactic. You go to South Africa, you go to Brazil, you go to India, you go to small countries, you go to big countries, criminalization is robust. So let's take a look at a few examples from Arun's text and think together about orienting energy in multiple paths toward universal goals. As Arun mentioned, he writes a lot about anti-racist history in the United States, liberal and radical anti-racist history. And he mentions in passing, for example, that during the Cold War, the US had a reputational issue to deal with, because during the Cold War, many, many places around the planet were actively and intensively involved in decolonizing themselves. And the question was, would those newly independent places look to capitalism, the US, or to socialism, the Soviet Union? Well, it is true the US had this reputational problem when it came to anti-Black racism and Jim Crow, but it also had a long-standing anxiety about a fifth column developing in the US among, for example, Black communists. And people like Esther Cooper Jackson, Pat Patterson, Dorothy Burnham, Charlene Mitchell, Howard Stress Johnson, many, many, many Black communists had been organizing for decades in urban and rural United States. Indeed, they were organizing for a world of sufficiency. We might call it Red Plenty, stealing Spofford's novel title, by figuring out what anti-racism actually was in practice. That's what Black communists were doing. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover built his entire career and power base from 1919 forward by seeing red in Black liberation. Indeed, COINTELPRO was initiated in 1956, not 1967. It might be that error was fixed by the time the book was published. Anticipating rather than following Al-Amin and others in the mid-60s. The discussion of Claudia Jones, which is extremely deep and refreshing, lays out a trajectory of so many different processes, including long-distance migration, including immigration, including criminalization, including deportation. All of these features of the combination of organized abandonment and organized violence condense in any account of Claudia Jones's life. Indeed, some of the people in the greater community of Black communists in the United States and beyond, together, as Arun discusses in the book, put together an argument called We Charge Genocide, which took up a new term, genocide, then in 1951, a new term, to discuss long-term vulnerabilities. It gives us a view into, and if I had any slides, this would be it. It gives us a view into internationalist imperative, like imperative, forms of struggle, including propaganda, and anti-racism as anti-capitalism, right? So that piece sort of gives us this triangle, and within the triangle, again, if I had a slide, I would show you a picture. We see, or can imagine, the infrastructures people create and use always for reasons of that facts value slippage bearing excess significance. So whatever infrastructures we come up with or they come up with will always, because of the slippage between facts and values, create or bear excess significance, which then becomes the material for not only the kinds of narratives that naturalize hunger and suffering and the wage relation, but also narratives that incite revolutionary struggle and activity. Surely, the multi-ethnic fascist rulers in the economic North attest to this point. The excess significance can be an impediment and it can be an opportunity. As history's protagonists move to conscious action, purposeful and potentially violent. And in the context of thinking about violence, all of the various violences that are the condition of possibility of us being together in this room tonight, in this building named as it's named, at this school named as it's named. So all of those violences. It's hard in that context to de-exceptionalize Nazi genocide from any perspective. I am not saying something normative that it should be. I'm saying it's hard to do. Because attempts to do so can sometimes obscure fascism, which is ripe and growing. Fascism as ideology, system, and outcome with racism at its core. If the central categorical contrast here is liberal versus structural, we should sort through some particulars from points of view of history's protagonists. So, as we know, and Arun just said, structures are residue of agency. Individual agency and collective agency. And such coordinated agency is reproduced daily by those entrusted with their operation, daily. Now, I'm a teacher, I reproduce it every day. Reproduction materializes in the process of transformation. So a structure transforms something, it has internal rules, and is both resistant to change, yet in various ways changes all the time because reproduction is necessarily differentiation. And if you doubt it, think about the fact that Arun told you his daughter is here. Reproduction is differentiation. I give you example. Complexity, as Arun argues, is an opportunity rather than an impediment, though frequently the best prepared to seize opportunities both embody and deepen the impediments, like black cops. And the US now has many major cities run by mayors who are themselves black cops. They came up from the street force, and their story, of course, is they fought their way into the police force when nobody wanted them, and they rose through the ranks and eventually became electoral political actors and are now the mayors of New York, formerly mayor of Chicago, and so on and so forth. This is a pattern. And it's a pattern further that we can see even in a recent decision by the Supreme Court of the United States banning affirmative action, except in the military. Except in the military. But even that was not an innovation on the part of this right-wing Supreme Court. 30 years ago, the state of California banned affirmative action, but without quite declaring it, they kept rigorous affirmative action policies in place for prison guards and cops, all through the state. And nobody raised a hackle, much less an eyelash. Liberal racism is at base, I'm almost done, okay? Are we good? Liberal racism is at base a market in which value will change as rational or irrational actors weigh what they'll surrender for what they want. Tulip bulbs or electric cars or a police state with cops of color. And police state socialism, man, is sweeping the Anglophone world, especially around the Atlantic, North Atlantic. The example of the Supreme Court of the United States exempting the military brings to mind work such as Von Ware's book on military migrants, work of one of Cynthia Enlow's students about Gurkhas. I mean, we can go on and on and on and see the patterns and examples. Liberals understand structural objectivity too, as constraint via sedimented values over time. Democracy and the market are really hard to tease apart as a matter of theoretical practicality, and it's something I think we need to put our minds to more. So what then is anti-structural, anti-racism opposition made of? Structures lead me to thinking about institutions, and I'm not going to go into details because Arun already discussed in his remarks, but certainly a case in point is the IRR, which was established thanks to one of those global foundations of the earlier part of the 20th century, trying to figure out how to make the world safe for capitalism in the context of decolonization. And race relations became the theme, both here in the UK and the United States, for how to understand the particularities of different peoples in different places in order to draw them in to the capitalist mode of production, or the colonial mode of production, whatever you want to call it. Designing institutions, of course, has been a huge global and globalizing project throughout modernity as imperialists partition and repartition the Earth's surface, and colonizers and neo-colonizers lay claim to resources. And in Q&A, we could discuss the Journal of Race Development, or the Ford Foundation, or the Catholic Church, or the East India Company. I mean, we have many examples. So in this context, one of many questions to explore is how racial ethnic reorganization of territories is happening now around the planet. This is not just like a white settler colony or white core EU thing. It's happening all over the planet. All over the planet. What are the impetuses that naturalize the notion that something called the nation state, or a territorial approximation of the same, should determine freshly who's in and who's out. Right? It is happening in Burkina Faso. It is happening in South Africa. It is happening in Assam. It is happening in the Dominican Republic. It is happening as well in the UK and the US. You get my point. How do various views of sovereignty as self-determination, inflamed by NGOs as well as by so-called tradition, further this kind of racial action and activity? Let's see, I'm going to cut to a chase, if not the chase. We talked a little bit, or Arun talked a little bit about narration, and narrative is, for me, and we who study literature and drama and films, it is the ordering of time, right? That's what narrative is. Narrative orders time. And then there is, at the same time, or simultaneously, the geometric ordering of space. Whether we're talking about nation states who are in the process of pulling people in and pushing them out, or the shape of global commodity chains, or the shape of long-distance migration paths and the remittances that frequently follow those paths in the other direction, and so forth. So the narrative ordering of time and the geometric ordering of space is what oppositional work is making too. Whether we are talking about transnational labor unions, not all labor unions are a bunch of white guys, or the movement of various resources, migrants, and so forth, we see the production of space as well as the production of narratives about how that space should work, narratives that have a normative aspect to them. And I have a whole list of examples we could talk about, and I would love to talk about G-force while we're together. And I have a couple of gripes, which I'll end with, not to be a downer, but I have to say, I love your writing. I've read your work for many years, Arun. I'm so bored of reading the same paragraph about the same 2 or 3 white people. I'm just tired of it. Like, who cares? And I guess it's a serious story because they keep popping up. Somebody always has something to say about David Harvey, Ellen Woods, Wendy Brown. Who cares? You know, and David's my friend. David's my friend, but what, why are we wasting all this ink on this when we have all this other thinking to do? I'm also bored of reading the same 3 or 4 sentences about Marx, as though that nappy-headed nerd never had a fresh thought. For example, so-called primitive accumulation is called so-called primitive accumulation. It's not called primitive accumulation. That chapter is called so-called primitive accumulation for a reason, and it comes in chapter, 26 in Capital Volume 1, also for a reason, which we might as well take seriously, rather than saying Marx didn't do this. Or, I don't know, write some fresh paragraphs about that. I have some questions about the nature of how we think about, or the politics through which we think about psychology, because Fanon's insights into the psychology of the tortured and the torturer have been very meaningful for many people, theoretically and presumably practically over time. And yet, at the same time, we turn our back on those who say, well, racism is, a psychological, it's unconscious, it's something else. So how do we reconcile or find the antagonistic contradiction within psychologizing and psychologizing? And the last thing I'd like to talk about is whether there's a tendency for all of us, no matter what we actually think, to try to look for the shelter of innocence, to describe those whose lives have been completely upended by war, neoliberalism, structural adjustment, climate change, criminalization, and so forth. And talking about such people as fleeing suggests there's an innocence there that others don't share. So why don't we decide we all did it, because to one degree or another we did, and upend the notion that there are ways of thinking historical protagonists through a lens of innocence when it's actually creative aggression that we must be attuned to and enhance. Thank you.
Thank you. I've had the chance to read the book, and I think it's a very good book indeed, and I'm very pleased for this launch. It's not a gripe, it's just asking you to develop a certain theme, which is, the content of the book is very much anti-imperialist as well as anti-capitalist, and you have a line in the book which says that liberals are blind to imperialism, or more words to that effect, or just don't give it any priority. And I think that's particularly true of Britain, I have to say. And it's in particularly true of what might be called the white left. You know, they just don't see their own country as being imperialist. And I just wondered whether you could speak more to that, because Roy debated with Lenin. Lenin wasn't the white left. I mean, he was breaking from imperialism. He was absolutely looking for revolt against colonialism. And I mean, I do think we need more of that here.
I'll just talk. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think you're right that I think that there's a particular problem with Britain in the way that we've sort of told this story about, you know, the empire ending a certain amount of decades in the past, and that's kind of done and dusted now, and we haven't even begun to think through how that shapes what's happening now in Britain. I mean, there's amazing work that's been done actually opening those sort of questions up over the last few years. I mean, we don't pay any attention to the role of Britain as an imperialist power today, right? Separately from the question of the past and how that shapes Britain today, you know, I mean, it astounds me that we have had so much reflection in Britain on the political process that led to the decision to participate in the war in Iraq in 2003 and afterwards. But we can have that huge amount of kind of energy and focus on that stuff, which is a debate about Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair and all that sort of stuff, and yet we've never even grappled with what happened in Iraq, really, right? And what this country did there, you know? We've never grappled with that and what that really means, how we destroyed that country, right? And that's the most obvious example, but we could find many others. We haven't grappled with the role of the City of London as continuing to be central to the way that imperialism works today, right? And we have an agenda. You know, we will have to dismantle that stuff. We will have to think about ways of changing how the City of London works, not just because of how it distorts life in Britain, because of the effects it has around the world. The tax havens that Britain hosts around the world, right, where wealth that's sucked out of people's lives around the world is then hoarded and hidden so we can't see where it is anymore, right? I mean, all these things are you know, Britain is playing a central role there, right? And so absolutely, you're right that these are things that we should be focusing on.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be able to ask a question, but I'm kind of surprised that there weren't a lot of other hands to compete with. But I unfortunately haven't read your book yet, but I really look forward to reading your book. But I'm very sympathetic to your argument, and I think that sort of our time, it seems to be, there are so many horrors and injustices around, but also a great deal of confusion and hypocrisy and a big feeling of kind of disempowerment that sort of Anton Curtis summed up as like, the more the system fails, the harder it seems to imagine an alternative to it. So it's great to hear an argument that is very clear about it's the class struggle, stupid, and we should focus on that. But there was one thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, which you didn't mention in your talk, about where you see within your argument the meaning and role of critical race theory, which has had so much prominence and influence in recent years in academia and in society, and more broadly around identity politics, which can be seen in quite crude terms, but has a role of both empowering people but can also divide people and obscure solidarity.
Okay, so I mean, on critical race theory, you know, I think you know, critical race theory is fundamentally an attempt within a particular academic discipline, law, right, to understand how racism can continue to be such a force in the United States, because it's mainly focused on the United States, even after the various legislative initiatives around the civil rights and so on, right? And that's essentially what it tries to do, and it comes up with a set of answers around that some of which are, I think, are valuable, some of which are not. It's a mixed bag for me. Obviously, the attack on CRT has absolutely nothing to do with the content of the work that's been done under it. It's simply a way of attacking any notion of anti-racist scholarship. And so, of course, we have to fight back against that. That doesn't mean that we have to accept every conclusion that CRT scholars come up with. I think on the part about identity, you know, you asked about identity politics, which is, I mean, you know, it depends what we mean by identity politics, right? And it's always where you've got to start with that question, because for a lot of people, identity politics simply means you're interested in some kind of movement for liberation that starts from an identity that might be a racial identity, an ethnic identity, a gender identity, right? And that's where we all start. We all start with some kind of positioning, some kind of identity in our society, and we're thinking that through when we're trying to think about the world we're in, and we move from there. The problem is to end there and think that that's the, you know, that one's identity is the start and end point of one's politics, right? So when we think about, you know, identity can mean an idea that we are shaped by some kind of set of cultural norms that makes us who we are, that's kind of passed on from generation to generation, right? A very fixed idea of identity. And I think that's a misconceived about how human beings are, and I think it's, in the end, politically conservative, because it is an idea of identity that erases the possibility of us always creating a new, right? Because in a way, if you take that view of identity, that who you are is fixed in some way, you're kind of putting yourself in a conservative box of never being able to really change very much. But if we're going to change everything, right, as we should be doing, we need to imagine that identity is a process, right, that's always unfolding, and it's something we're always making anew, right? And if we do that, then identity politics, a politics of identity, doesn't have to be something that erects these fundamental barriers between us. Now, in particular contexts, whether we, you know, like, so think, you know, the book talks about Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, or leader of the Black Power movement, and Ruthie referred to him as well. Now, what he was thinking about was he's talking about a kind of, he's starting from the position that white supremacy has inculcated a negative idea of blackness in everyone's minds, white and black, right? And that there has to be some kind of process of grappling with that as a starting point to some kind of radical politics at this moment, right, in the 1960s. So there's an identity politics there, but it's not the identity politics that says that you can derive your political vision from simply the fact of your blackness. It's an attempt to say you start there, but then you go forward. And in the end, the question that he's asking is, as black people in the late 1960s, do we build a movement with white people in the United States to change the United States in the fundamental revolutionary ways that he was interested in doing, or is that not going to work at that particular moment because white people aren't going to be revolutionaries with us? So then, in that case, are we going to look for revolutionaries elsewhere? And that's what he says to do: to look for them in Puerto Rico, to look for them in Vietnam, to look for them in Palestine, right? And so it's a matter of looking at that particular set of circumstances and figuring out how the question of identity and how the question of building with others is going to work at that particular time. But it's not an answer for all time, and it's always a process. Do you want to share some thoughts on that?
I'd love to. That's all right. Yeah, I was thinking when I read that section of your book a lot about Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa. And many people erroneously think the Black Consciousness Movement was a separatist movement. They think that because they don't read anything about the movement. They just read the title and think they know what it says. Including there were white South Africans who thought that. Like, they just didn't bother. And what Biko's argument, again, was we have to make ourselves anew. Let's think of the old new man, new woman, new person, new human. And in doing so, we become able to do the necessary thing, which is to combine our energy with the energy of other oppressed people, whoever they are, in order to make a new world. In that case, it was South Africa, but in order to make a new world. And so, as Arun said in his discussion of the kinds of organizations that arise from the ground that then become the possibility for making change, the Black Consciousness Movement, as is true of so many movements around the planet, started with very local things, people doing things that, as Stuart Hall puts it, bite into their existence in order to do something else, to rearrange the present, which then opens the possibility of thinking the future differently, and noticing also who else is being bitten, right? Who else's existence is being bitten. So if we think of identification as identification of purpose, that might free us from being stuck in characteristics as somehow the limit, rather than the opening possibility. Thank you.
Hi, there's been a through line in your talk today about this kind of trifecta of neoliberalism, liberalism, and I guess structural anti-racism. And I was wondering if you could expand on how you theorize and draw on or critique fascism, particularly because I think fascism is, or liberalism is fascism's non-antagonistic kin. And I think fascism, perhaps more blatantly than liberalism, demonstrates how race is always already gendered, sexualized, classed, etc. So how do you formulate, how does fascism, subtend this trifecta that you've been critiquing so far? And what is, structural anti-racism's kind of formulation within that?
Well, I think one of the things I try and think about in the book is that there's actually two different ways of thinking about fascism as well that correspond to these two traditions, right? So in the sort of liberal story, fascism emerges as this kind of moment of a break with liberal democracy, right? It's the kind of collapse of liberal democracy. It's this kind of one-off event that then we enter into a new era where we're now in a fascist era, right? A fascist government. And so then the debate is always, are we on the verge of that break, right? And you know, when Donald Trump got elected president, you saw this massive, you know, kind of flurry of texts and people having this debate: is Trump a fascist? You know, how do we save liberal democracy? Are we on the verge of it falling off this cliff into fascism, right? And of course, the radical tradition sees fascism differently, right? Because it's about saying fascism is present in a lot more places and a lot more times in ways that are less about this dramatic break, but more about an everyday tendency. As soon as you have a state with the capacity to inflict violence through police forces, through military, through borders, through prisons, right? There's a kind of tendency to fascism just inherent in those infrastructures, and that's something that will be experienced differently by different peoples, right? Based on things like race, right? So I think when you look at it that way, you see a different picture, and of course this is, you know, Aimé Césaire, I think, is key here, right, in thinking about how the story that gets told about how fascism emerges in Europe leaves out the fact that fascism was there in the colonial infrastructures, and it comes back to Europe, right? It's the boomerang, right, of particular forms of political violence returning to Europe from where they'd been deployed for a long time, right? And I think that's as true today as it was in the 1950s, 40s when he's writing that. You know, Donald Trump is the war on terror coming home to me, right? Like the both in terms of the Islamophobia that was central to his first election campaign, as well as the fact that it's the kind of military defeats that the United States experienced in its wars that were not ever necessarily described as military defeats, but that's what they were, and that's how they were understood by military personnel, right? Who then come back, and there needs to be some explanation, right, for what's happened here, what's gone wrong, right? And someone like Donald Trump and the broader kind of far-right movements in the United States are offering that explanation. They're saying, yeah, the reason that the United States can't win a war anymore is because we've been weakened by, and then fill in whatever you want, whether it's, you know, immigrants, Muslims, trans people, et cetera, right? And so I think the way, and you know, so it's for that reason that the crucial political implication of that is we don't fight fascism by defending the very institutions that make it possible, right? The way we fight fascism is by taking on those institutions, and we don't see. The old argument that used to get a lot in Britain as well was that fighting fascism is a form of anti-racism, and in fact the most important form of anti-racism. But in fact, it's the other way around, right? We fight racism in order to remove the possibility of fascism, right? It's not that fascism is the core of our anti-racist struggle, in the sense of, you know, defeating the far right. The far right are a symptom of a broader and deeper problem that we need to tackle, and we're not going to defeat the far right unless we do that first.
Can I ask you something? Please. Could you talk about the rise of fascism elsewhere in the world, like leave Europe for a moment?
Sure.
And the States?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think let's see, where do I want to go? Let's go to India.
Let's go to India. That's where I want to go.
What's that?
What's the natural journey?
Is the return migration?
Yeah. Let's go India. Okay, well, I think I would make exactly the same arguments about India, right? Exactly the same. And this is why, because for the same reasons that fascism thrives in a racist society like Britain or the United States, it thrives in a society like India, whose political economy depends on social differentiations that are race-like, right? So, for example, the oppression of Muslims in India. For example, the caste system in India. These are things that have long histories, but in the modern era of colonial capitalism and then after independence get taken up in ways that reify those divisions and distinctions and give them a different kind of social function to what they would have had in the pre-colonial era. And then that becomes the kind of reservoir from which fascist movements like the RSS, the BJP, the Hindutva, Sangh Parivar, etc., can then gradually over time start to find a base. The RSS, which is the kind of, I think we can say that the RSS, which is the sort of foot soldiers of fascism in India, is the largest social movement in the world. Millions of members who who believe in essentially turning India into a kind of Hindu fascist state. So we can learn a lot from. I think the fact that the picture has these similarities and we can make these transnational comparisons tells us that what we're dealing with here is not about. What we're dealing with here is about the neoliberal world, right? That we've built up. That is generating these processes in India as much as it is in the UK and the United States.
Are we out of time? We're out of time. No, I just want to ask a follow-up, because this is really interesting. It seems to me then that maybe what the dynamic is thinking racism and fascism as co-constitutive interdependencies might mean it's not a matter of we fight fascism by fighting racism or the other way around, but that the fight is constantly shaping. That fighting fascism must be fighting racism will be fighting fascism. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think I think there's a tendency to. I think in Britain, for example, there's been a tendency to say, we have to prioritise fighting particular far-right organisations, and the anti-racist struggle kind of gets simplified and reduced down to just that goal, right? And that's the so I think that's mistaken, and I think we need to see that we're missing a much bigger picture if we do.
Agreed.
Just one very quick question, and crediting Liam, who I think in a workshop earlier raised it. I wasn't even there, but it was a question. My name is Ali. I've worked in 2 largely liberal foundations that are resourcing movements work. And what has happened in the sort of Lankelly Chase, where I currently work, is that we had an announcement that we are wholly redistributing assets. And I was very surprised to read in the Guardian article, our chief exec quoting Cedric Robinson. And I was like, I never had you for reading such literature. And I think we are at a space where those liberal institutions that you were initially anxious about their responses are discovering these traditions and responding with ideas of relinquishing control or there is nothing to be done, let's burn it all away. And I wonder what is the response that is evolved in the United States, because that response of diversity training can't go on forever. So they must have some new responses to contend with the radical history, because like now, after 2020, they've had time to read a bit.
What's that foundation called? Something Kelly Chase? Chase Kelly, yeah. I got quite a chuckle. I'm not altogether sure the CEO read Cedric Robinson. He might have like glanced at the title of something that maybe Robin Kelly wrote in the Boston Review and pretend, which is how most people I encounter pretend to know Cedric's work, which is nothing against Robin, whose work is awesome. I think that the really, really, really fat foundations aren't about to disband themselves. I mean, even like Soros, which is a big foundation, announced more than 10 years ago that it was going to unroll in 10 years. It's still around. But the big ones, the mega ones like Ford and Mellon and so forth, they're not going anywhere. And they will continually practice what Olufemi Taiwo calls elite capture and take ideas from the ground and then turn them into something fundable and reproducible and measurable and all those ables, which doesn't mean never take their money and go, thank you, and then go do the thing you were going to do, and then send them the report, or don't. Philanthropy is private allocation of the stolen social wage. You know that, we all know that, and it's not going anywhere. And the extent to which one of the kind of urgent human movement issues on the planet is the production of stateless people, or people who are virtually stateless, goes hand in hand with the production of stateless money. Like all this money that's hiding out, enabled by whatever tax authorities, is hiding out in places not only like the Cayman, it's hiding out in the United States of America. In South Dakota. Like that's the number 2 offshore loot hiding places on the planet. And we can tell an entire story about colonialism, indigenous genocide, treaty non-respect, the complete abandonment of rural peoples, whatever their race, ethnic origin is, and the rise of credit card debt as a way for people whose wages have not changed to be able to buy the things they need, or even the things they want. I got nothing against desire. And South Dakota, the center of all of these activities, including changed usury laws, is also the place where all these richies hide their loot. It's all right there. It's all right there. So there's so much to be done.